The question I'm going to ask today, Dad, Papa, is...
The question that we're going to talk about is...
What is the most scared I've ever been? That one leapt off the page for me.
What was my first big trip?
How was the day of your wedding?
I'm going to talk about how I almost died twice in 2 years.
She was telling me her life story, and she didn't know it was me.
That is an absolutely true story.
And I can tell you about it.
Welcome to the Storyworth Podcast. I'm your host and Storyworth co-founder, Krista Baum. Each week on the podcast, we ask questions that help us hold on to a person's life story. We tell stories that help us get to know the people around us, the people in our communities, even better. This week on the show, after a father dies, his son picks up the unfinished book manuscript his dad left behind. The son spends more than 10 years writing his dad's unfinished book. And in a way, he gets to keep talking to his dad beyond the grave.
I'm Jamie Calvin, lifelong Chicagoan on the south side of Chicago, a writer. And what I want to describe is a pivotal episode at the beginning of my career as a writer when I picked up a manuscript that my father had invested himself in. He died in 1974. It was actually 50 years ago, this October 29th. I was living in San Francisco, starting out as a writer, and got a call from my mother. And he had health issues. So a heart attack in his mid-50s, a stroke a couple of years later. But he was functioning at the highest level, intellectually and in his work. And my mother called, and I actually remember that her voice sounded like a little girl. And she told me he was gone. And my very first thought was, who will I talk to now? Who will I talk to? When I was little, he was great fun. And I saw this with my siblings as well. He'd get down on the floor with us and play with us. And I always felt like I was an interesting person to him, even as a small child. That interested him. It's just he was so alive to the world and to possibility. And as I got older, we would take walks all the time. And through the very streets I walk and run now every day, we'd take walks. We'd walk out to the lakefront. And I'm 6'1". He was, I don't know what his height was, but he was fairly short. So it was always, me kind of leaning in to him. He was, small, delicately featured. We're in Chicago, and people would sometimes mistake him on the University of Chicago campus for Saul Bellow, who was a colleague. And he once joked that he, accepted all sorts of praise for Herzog when it came out, walking across campus. There's a quality I rarely encounter in people, but when I do, I greatly, greatly admire it, which I think of as intellectual gaiety, which doesn't mean frivolousness. He could talk about the most serious matters with appropriate gravity, but there was a sense that his sense of humor was still present. And we would talk about mostly what was on his mind, what he was working on. We talked a lot about baseball, which was a common interest, and sort of high-level gossip. He was really interested in just kind of what happens in people's lives and just the way in which people respond or fail to respond to the things they're summoned to in life. the call came in the morning. And, I was in San Francisco. I immediately booked a flight home that day. I came to the house, and it was one of these big houses on the south side of Chicago. He was a law professor at the University of Chicago Law School, and the faculty lived sort of beyond their means in these sort of almost mansion-like houses on the south side. And the third floor had what had actually been a ballroom, so-called, a big room for dancing and entertaining. And that was his office. And that night, I climbed the stairs to his study. He had a normal-sized desk that sat in the middle of the office. And then, because he had all this space, he had a kind of horizontal filing system. So there were piles of paper and, clippings and documents all around the room. He never threw anything away, but he would just sort of catapult on to the next project, and these piles would form. And it was like this sort of geography or ecology of his thinking over decades. So, I just sort of found myself in this physical manifestation, this landscape of his passions, preoccupations, the things that occupied him through his career.
The day Jamie's dad died, he was working at home in his office. Jamie's mom was downstairs, and in the afternoon, she called him down for lunch. But when his dad didn't answer, his mom went to his office to check on him.
She went upstairs and found him just, sitting peacefully in his desk, and I think sort of slumped, his glasses having fallen to the floor. I even know how his papers were arranged around him and what book was open on the desk. I actually know what he was thinking about. He sort of died in mid-sentence.
So Jamie, when he's upstairs that night in his dad's office, he's standing over that very desk his dad sat at every day. And it's like he could reach out to the last moment his dad was still here and hold on to it.
He was working on the book that he had devoted the last 4 or 5 years of his life to, sort of intellectual history of the First Amendment at the level of the Supreme Court. This was a project he had contemplated from the beginning of his career, and he was very, very productive, but he kept deferring it while doing other things. And he left a 1,200-page first draft. So the manuscript is an extraordinary document. He was a very fluent writer, and he just wanted to keep going, maintain momentum on this project. And then each summer, when he was off from teaching, my parents would rent a little cottage on Martha's Vineyard, and he would, sit in a chair outside reading through his manuscript, and he would make marginal notes. So the manuscript, I have it to this day, is an extraordinary document. It's very, very thick. And I think I counted, there's something on the order of 600 marginal notes in it. And they vary from a question mark or an exclamation point to whole pages of sort of commentary of him being in conversation with himself on the back side of a manuscript page. There are some very touching notes. He wrote a note to himself, "This is a swell chapter." There's another note, "Tell joke here." He left this manuscript, which was so precious in terms of his aspirations for it and what he'd poured into it. And it was completely unpublishable in the form he left it.
When Jamie saw this manuscript, he knew he couldn't just leave it there to be forgotten to history.
It was too important, both in a personal, emotional way, and I think in a public way, in terms of the quality of his thinking about these issues, to just put aside and say, this is one of the sad things that happens in life. But it was a genuine puzzle. What do you do with this? What's appropriate? And what would be involved in keeping it his book?
Jamie didn't think he could find a legal scholar who'd be able to pick up where his father left off.
He wrote unusually fluently for a law professor. So one of the things that distinguished his work was his sort of literary style.
On the other hand, Jamie didn't think he could do it.
Because I'm not a lawyer. I'm a writer. I was a writer early in my career.
But he did know his father's voice better than anyone he could think of.
I did have a real literary and conversational kinship with my father, in the sense that my sense of language grew out of conversation with him. And, after discussion in the family and with colleagues, it was decided that the answer to that dilemma was for me to prepare it for publication. I was in my mid-20s. I was, involved with the woman who became my wife, Patricia Evans. And I ended up spending fully 10 years working on it.
This project would go on to change the rest of Jamie's life.
I wouldn't quite say that when I went up the stairs, I was one person, and when I came down, I was another, but it was an absolutely pivotal moment in my life. It was just an immense intellectual, emotional effort and journey, fueled by this combination. There should be a word for it, but a sort of energy arising out of a combination of grief and love, and just a resistance to surrendering everything to death.
When Jamie began editing his dad's book, on this topic he knew very little about, it was like he was decoding some mysterious message from a faraway land.
So in the course of doing the project, I would, I would read a chapter over and over again, a draft of a chapter. I would read all the relevant cases, immerse myself in the Supreme Court decisions. I read no other commentary, no other legal commentary.
The most important thing to Jamie was preserving his father's voice.
Always trying to be true to my father's thinking. It felt like a continuing conversation kind of across the grave. It involved, in a way that was just so intense and so intimate, trying with every bit of energy and attention I could bring to bear, following the movement of his thought, to see if I could plausibly add another sentence here, or write a passage there that would be in keeping with it and wouldn't be just sort of hijacking it, trying to figure out what he had in mind. That was what was hard. Some of the marginalia was like Zen koans, and I would sort of brood and think. I would write up memos.
Years went on, and Jamie's life did too. All the while, he kept working on his father's book, but he couldn't bring himself to finish it.
It sort of felt at times towards the end like this kind of life and death undertaking. Can I actually pull this off? Can I survive it? Could I survive failure? And what does success look like with a project of this nature? There's language in the Talmud that it's not upon you to finish the task, but neither can you desist from it. And that, that recognition that the real work is the work of generations and you make your contribution. Part of finishing the book was accepting that there was an essentially impossible task and it could never be completed. But in some way, the life I've lived since has been a kind of finishing of the book, sort of living out a certain set of values and questions and a certain way of being in the world. When I had finished it, I mean, it's never finished, but, when I'd gotten to the point where I could relinquish it, the publishing house thought it would be, both appropriate and good for the book to make it Calvin and Calvin, to make, a collaboration across the generations. And I insisted on being, editor, but there was a question about what to call it. And I titled it A Worthy Tradition, Freedom of Speech in America. The process of doing the book sort of embodied something about the nature of tradition. And, he died in 1974. I'm a product of the 60s, frisky, young, self-styled radical. And really the most formative experience in my life was subordinating myself to this tradition. And it's really shaped my life and work since. I remember the day that we took this big box. It was a huge manuscript, and took it out of the house to deliver it to the publisher. And it was just such a powerful physical thing, the idea of getting the book out of the house so life could go forward. There was genuine concern that when I finished the book, I would have a kind of renewal of grief and disorientation. And on the contrary, what the book represented for me was an extraordinary vehicle for working through grief. And I really felt a kind of unburdening, have been these sort of discourses among men who feel like they didn't get what they needed from their father, or men who spend their whole lives looking for father figures. I'm not that guy. I'm not that guy. I think got everything I could possibly get. And then the book process was a sort of completion of that. The thing that I do think about, partly because I'm situated where I'm situated, I do sort of imagine sometimes what it would be like to take a walk with him when I'm senior. I'm 76, he died at 60. I'm 16 years older than he was when he died. And, in some sense, far more experienced in a variety of ways in the world. And I would love to take a walk with him. I'm talking to you from the south side of Chicago, and I actually live on the streets I grew up on, so I'm just a few blocks from the house my parents lived in. Walking under trees, I learned to ride a bicycle under. There's this continuity in my world, and so many of our conversations were on the hoof, walking together. And just to have a random conversation, not so much some really specific theme, but, I know that wonderful mix of conversation that we'd be talking about, gossiping about whoever it was who lived in that house, and talking about this, the state of the democracy, and just see how he responded and let the conversation flow.
Harry Calvin was a renowned legal scholar at the University of Chicago. Jamie Calvin is an investigative journalist and the founder of the Invisible Institute. Their book is called A Worthy Tradition, Freedom of Speech in America. That's it for this episode of the Storyworth Podcast. I'm Krista Baum. Thanks so much for listening. If you want to get started writing your own book of life stories or want to give the gift of Storyworth to a loved one, head over to Storyworth.com. And if you want one of your stories to be considered for the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us at Storyworth.com/podcast. The Storyworth Podcast was produced by the folks at Good Weight Productions. Remember, everyone has a story worth sharing. See you soon.